Gamarzoba, and welcome to the History of Sakartvelo, Georgia. I'm your host, Roberto, and this is Myth 5, Warkhag and His Sons. This tale comes out of the Nart Sagas, and I would like to give credit to Walter May for his translation, and to John Colarusso and Tamerlan Salbia for their edits to modernize the work. I also want to give credit to Sylvan for their amazing art. Warkhag and His Sons come from the Nart Sagas, which are a series of stories from the Ossetian culture found in both North Georgia and southern Russia along the Caucasus mountain range. Before people start yelling at me and telling me that the Ossetians aren't Georgian, I will say this. The Ossetians are found throughout Georgian territory, mainly in the Russian-occupied South Ossetia. This means they are part of Georgia and Georgia's history, and we have seen them multiple times throughout our narrative and will continue seeing them. So, Ossetian history and stories will be covered on this show. But for now, sit back and enjoy the tale, and remain with us for a discussion about the story with Brendan. Part 1. Warkhag and His Sons. Chapter 1. The birth of Akshar and Akshartag. Warkhag was in those days among the eldest of the Narts. To him were born 2 sons, twins. One came at the first cockcrow, the other before the morning star, Bonvarnon, had appeared in the sky at the second cockcrow. The rays of the risen sun shone into the heart of Warkhag, and he felt how dear to him were those 2 newborn babes. So that the day of their birth should bring the newcomers happiness, Warkhag prepared a feast, consisting of game caught in the hunt, to regale his guests. Warkhag invited the heavenly smith, Kurdalagan, and the ruler of the deep seas, Don Betir, and highly esteemed Narts, Bora, and other, were called to that rich feast. Kurdalagan took a fancy to Warkhag's son, and named them so. The elder he called Akshar, and the younger Akshartag. Why did he give them these names? Speaking of a brave man, one says Akshar. The first brother was such a young fellow, and so received that name. But the second brother was even bolder, and so he was called Akshartag, which means Bravest. To celebrate the naming of the newborns, Kurdalagan presented Warkhag with a magic flute, which he had forged himself from tempered steel at his heavenly forge. The Narts placed this wonderful flute on the festive tables, and it began to play on its own accord, merrily and resoundingly. Take a cup of mead, take a cup of mead, drink it down indeed, to please God. For 7 days and 7 nights, Warkhag's guests feasted, and when the feast was over, Kurdalagan leapt onto the crest of a fiery storm cloud, and like wide-winged Pakunza, flew off on it to the heavens. Don Betir changed into a pearly, fiery fish, and disappeared into the sea depths. The Narts, as befits those who spend their life on campaign, went off on a dangerous expedition. Akshar and Akshartag grew with each passing hour. In one day they grew 2 inches. In a night, a whole hand's breadth. They were a mischievous pair. They made for themselves bows and arrows, and there was not a bird who could fly over their heads. They shot them down immediately, and they fell like stones to the earth. The whole world soon knew that the Nart Warkhag had 2 gallant grown-up twin sons, Akshar and Akshartag. Chapter 2. Akshar's Sword. Akshar and Akshartag soon grew up, and there came the day when they decided to go on a quest for a year. They made all their gear ready, and set off on the road. They came to a place where the road divided in 3, and agreed thus: we shall take one side road each, and the middle road will be our place of meeting. Let us both put one of our own arrows we have beneath this stone by the wayside. Whoever returns, let him come to this stone and see whether his brother's arrow is still there. Akshar and Akshartag then parted, traveling different roads. A year passed by, and Akshartag returned to the agreed spot, lifted the stone, and saw that Akshar's arrow still lay there, covered with moss and mold. Akshartag was at once disturbed. What had happened to his brother? He set out at once on the road that Akshar had taken. He traveled a long time through forest and field and over mountains, and toward evening he came to the Black Ravine. There he stayed for the night, and saw in his dream that his brother had been taken prisoner. At once, Akshartag jumped on and went onward. Again he traveled all day, and toward evening he came to the White Ravine. He rested once more for the night in a forest grove, and had only just fallen asleep when he saw the same troubled dream as on the first night. Again he jumped up, and still full of alarm he went onward. From morning till evening he traveled, and now before him he saw the Red Ravine. But how could he not help feeling hungry after such long travels? He could not sleep, but went in search throughout a grove, hoping to find some wild game to shoot. Suddenly he saw a lake, and on the shore stood a tent. In the tent from time to time some strange, incomprehensible light appeared, and then disappeared. That tent is put there for some purpose, he thought. Maybe I can find here what has happened to my brother. He stepped a little nearer to this tent and began to peer in through the flap. He saw that inside the tent an iron door had been set in the floor, which opened and closed by itself. Each time it opened, a light also glowed from somewhere in the tent. Akshartag was amazed. What kind of wonder was this? The next time the light shone, he loosed an arrow in its direction. Straight away, he then heard a piercing cry. Such a shriek that the trees bent down, and the lake seethed up and hurled waves ashore, and the beasts sleeping for the night in the grove grew frightened, and began to run away, bumping into one another in their haste. A little time passed, and all grew still again. The lake gathered its waves together, the trees straightened up, and the beasts quietly returned to their rest. It began to grow light. As soon as dawn broke, Akshartag saw an old woman come out of the tent. She had one crooked eye quite sightless, and in the other sighted eye stuck the arrow he had shot. She was moaning and groaning. Akshartag came nearer and saw that she carried his brother's scarf in her hand. He asked straight away, "Who are you, old woman? How do you come to have my brother's scarf in your hand?" "Ah, young man, I don't know who you are, but if you call yourself Akshar's brother, then you are my brother as well. I am one of the Narts. When he set out for the underwater dwellers, the Bisanags, he left me his scarf and said sternly, 'Take care of it, my sister. If blood appears on it, that means I am in difficulties. But if no blood appears, then you need not worry about me.' I have just seen blood on the scarf. That means that he is in great trouble, your brother Akshar, and he has probably fallen into the hands of the Bisanags. Now, I have been blinded, and I don't know what I can do." "Is there no remedy that would give you back the sight of one eye, at least?" asked Akshartag. "If someone gathered some drops of morning dew and mixed them with doe's milk, and sprinkled it on my wound, then I would see." Akshartag ran off into the forest, caught a young deer and milked it, and mixed with it some fresh dewdrops. Then he gently removed the arrow from the woman's eye, and poured into the wound the prepared mixture. She at once began to see again, and was happy to make out Akshartag. "How do you think my brother fell prisoner to the Bisanags?" Akshartag then asked her. "I shall tell you all, from the beginning, as far as I know it. The Bisanags went out hunting, and suddenly the gates of the sky opened, and out fell a piece of heavenly ore, right on the head of the eldest Bisanag, and passed right through him. The Bisanags carried off that piece of heavenly ore with them, below the water. Akshar heard about this, and thought that he would take this piece of ore from them. When he came, they must have surrounded him, tied him up, and carried him off as a prisoner with them. Just today, I was making plans about what to do, when because of your arrow, I was unable to carry on." "But to whom among the Narts do you belong? And why do you call yourself one of our women? To whom are you sister?" Then afterward explain why, when I looked at your tent at night, there appeared and disappeared a strange light. "I am Warkhag's sister, but I have lived here for a long time. My husband shared a table with the sun, and the sun presented him with a white stone. The stone I hung around my neck every night, and it lighted up my path. The light you saw was the light from it." "Where then has your husband gone?" inquired Akshartag. The old lady pointed to the iron door, lying in the ground. "That door leads to an underground cave, and at evening, on Saturdays, it opens. The Bisanags come to catch at least one person living on Earth's surface. If they don't succeed, one of them dies. So it was that they once took my husband, but what happened to him, I do not know, just as I do not really know what has happened to Akshar." Akshartag and the old woman waited till Saturday evening came. When the door to the underworld opened, Akshartag put his shoulder under it to prevent it from closing. then gave a great heave and tore it out, together with its hinges, and flung it aside. After that, he and the old lady went into the cavern, and saw with horror that a man lay bound with arms and legs spread out, and from his beard and mustaches was woven a rope-like ladder that stretched up to the surface. "There he is, my husband, the master of my head!" cried his wife. Akshartag drew his sword and cut the man's bonds, and then cut short his beard and whiskers. The man stood up and thanked Akshartag. Then they went together into the cavern, and suddenly saw Akshar standing as though he had been crucified, with his back to the cavern wall, while the Bisanags were shooting arrows at him, and they began attacking him with their swords. Seeing this, Akshartag fell on them in a fury, and began to hew them down, while Warkhag's sister and her husband chased those who fled and killed them. Thus Akshartag freed his twin brother, Akshar. "You and your husband go along home together, and Akshartag and I will come to you later," said Akshar. The husband and wife went off together, while the brothers looked for the storeroom where the Bisanags kept the ore. They found this heavenly ore at last, where the Bisanags had hidden it, and carried it off to the smith of the gods, Kurdalagon, and from it he made for Akshar a two-edged sword. Such a sword it was that from a single blow any stone or any metal would fall apart, while the blade itself was never blunted. When Akshar and Akshartag descended to earth again from Kurdalagon's forge, they found the Bisanag chief, Karamag, waiting for them with more men. Akshartag at once engaged them in a furious battle, but Karamag struck Akshartag such a cunning blow that he fell senseless to the ground, and his sword dropped from his hand. Just then, one of the servants of Don Betir appeared and whispered to Akshar, "Smear your blade with this fish oil, and you will overcome your enemies." Akshar at once smeared his sword with the fish oil, and then when Karamag raised his sword to strike him, Akshar parried the blow, and Karamag's blade shattered into tiny fragments, like little tin tacks. Akshar went on to slay all his Bisaneg opponents, to the last one. The Don Betir servant, who advised Akshar how to avoid defeat, then carried Akshartag off to the milky lake, and bathed him in its healing waters, where he immediately recovered consciousness. The word about Akshar's wonderful sword flew round among all the Narts. They all gathered to see, and stood in amazement before that wondrous weapon. Since that time, whenever difficulties faced the Narts, Akshar went into battle against their enemies in the vanguard with his wonder-working sword. For its invincible durability, it received the name Akshartag, which means Akshar's sword. After Akshar's death, his eldest son inherited the sword. Since then, it has been a Nart custom that the eldest son receives his father's sword, and the youngest son inherits his horse. Chapter 3. The Apple of the Narts. An apple tree grew in the Narts' orchard. Like heavenly azure, its blossoms shone, but each day only one apple grew ripe on it. That was a golden apple, and it gleamed like fire. It had also life-giving powers, and cured people from all kinds of diseases, and healed all kinds of wounds. Only from death could it not save one. In the course of a day, such an apple ripened, but during the night someone always stole it. The Narts went on guard in turn, every night, but nobody ever saw anyone stealing the apple, though it continued to disappear each night. It became Warkhag's turn to stand on guard in the orchard. He called his sons Akshar and Akshartag and said to them, "Go, my sons, and protect the golden apple. All my hopes are set on you. If you do not preserve it, then you know what will happen. All three Nart tribes will gather here, and men from each of the three families. One of them will cut off your heads, the second will cut off your arms, and the third will stick on a stake the head of one of you and the arm of another, and I shall remain alone in my old age, with none to protect me nor feed me." "Have no fear, father. We shall guard the golden apple tree," his sons replied. "Get along, then. I know that you are afraid of nothing. Only I myself am afraid that you shall not guard the apple well," said their father. The fence around the orchard was of reindeer antlers, and it was so high that not even a bird could fly over it. The brothers sat under the magic tree and had their supper, and the younger one, Akshartag, said to the elder one, Akshar, "We shall stand guard by turns. You lie down now and sleep till midnight. From midnight it will be your turn to watch." Akshar agreed, lay down, and slept. He awoke at midnight and said to his brother, "May God forgive me, Akshartag, but have I not overslept? No, it is not midnight yet. Sleep on a little, said Akshartag. Akshar was glad to hear that, and slept again. Then, at about the hour when night begins to change to day, some kind of bird, it seemed, flew to the tree. The apple was suddenly lit up, and Akshartag saw a dove near the magic apple. She plucked the apple by its stem, and Akshartag straightway shot an arrow at her, so that half of her wing fell to the earth, and the dove, covered in blood, flew lower unevenly and let the apple fall to the ground. Then Akshartag woke up Akshar. You see these drops of blood? He said to the brother. I shot a dove in our apple tree. She flew off, and see, here is half her wing. Very low, only just above the earth she flew, leaving a trail of blood. I must follow that track. I must catch her or die in the attempt. There's nothing else left for me to do. Akshartag carefully bound up his victim's half wing in a silken handkerchief and put it in the bosom of his coat. And when it grew quite light, he said to Akshar, I am off to seek that wounded bird. What do you say to that? I shall come with you, wherever you go, replied Akshar. So the brothers followed the bloody trail that led them to the seashore. It goes on into the water, said Akshar. And Akshartag replied, I shall go to the bottom of the sea. Wait for me here. If the waves throw up bloody foam on the shore, that means I am no longer in the land of the living, and you had better return home. If the waves throw up white foam, then wait for me here. Wait for just 1 year. Very well, answered Akshar, and remained on the shore. Then Akshartag pulled up the ends of his overcoat and stepped into the water, and down to the bottom he went. Chapter 4. The Beauty Zarasha. After a long descent through the dim waters, Akshartag found himself in the house of Don Betir. The walls of the house were made of mother of pearl, the floor was of blue crystal, and the morning stars shone through the ceiling. Akshartag stepped across the threshold, and there he saw 7 brothers sitting, along with 2 sisters, one more beautiful than the other. Like gold glittered and gleamed the maiden's fair hair. Good day to you, said Akshartag as he greeted them. May happiness ever fill your home. May you be blessed by a kindly fate, one of the 7 brothers and one of the pair of sisters replied. They rose and made a place for him to be seated. The 3 who were older than he sat on one side, the 4 who were younger on the other. They looked Akshartag up and down, and said, None like you has ever been in our home before, and never will be again. We should be joyful at your coming, and greet you with honor, but we cannot do so now, since we are in mourning. God save you from all sorrow. What woe is troubling you? The eldest brother answered him so. We have 3 sisters, and one of them has been going into the Nart's orchard, and it has ended badly for her. There each day a golden apple grows and ripens. At night our sister changed into a dove and stole it away. More than once we told her that the Nart youths were bold, and no birds dare fly over their heads, so don't go after any more apples. But she did not listen to us. The Narts Akshar and Akshartag were guarding the apple tree last night, and wounded our sisters fatally. May they cut each other down with their swords. They had only just pronounced this name when a groan was heard from the adjoining chamber. Who is that groaning? Inquired Akshartag. It is our Zarasha, of whom we have told you, they replied. Is there any remedy that will cure her? Asked Akshartag. There is such a remedy, answered one of the brothers. If anyone can put back the missing half of her wing in its proper place, she will be cured, and her life will be saved. If not, she will surely die. How would you reward anyone who cured your sister? We should give our beloved sister Zarasha to him in marriage. The gods have decreed that only such a one should she marry. Then Akshartag boldly told the brothers the truth. I am Warkhag's son. Akshartag is my name. The half-wing of your sister is in my keeping. I was the one who wounded her, and I will be the one to cure her. Bring her in here, I beg you. The brothers' faces all lit up with happiness, and they answered Akshartag, Our sister Zarasha is seriously ill, and we cannot move her out here to you. You yourself must cross the threshold of her chamber. Then the young Nart stepped across the threshold. A beautiful young woman was lying in bed, and her golden hair fell over her shoulders and down onto the floor. The sun was laughing on her face, and the moon was shining upon her breasts. She turned toward Akshartag, and he could not help smiling with happiness. He took from his belt the silk handkerchief, and out of it he took the half-wing and laid it on Zarasha's wound. And straightway she became 7 times more lovely than before. The 7 brothers and her 2 sisters were all so glad, and they happily gave Zarasha to Akshartag as his bride. One day, then another, and so on for a week. The wedding feast lasted for Akshartag and for Zarasha, the daughter of Don Betir. They fitted one another like the sun and the moon among their guests at the festive board. Day followed day, week followed week. Akshartag and his beautiful bride Zarasha lived in the underwater land of Don Betir. Then came the time when Akshartag remembered how his brother was still waiting for him, and he grew sad. He said to Zarasha, "I cannot live here any longer. I must go to meet my brother and then return home. If you have a home of your own, then we must hasten there. It is not good for me to remain here any longer." She was already with child, and wished for it to be born in her husband's home, as custom demanded. In the hour of farewell, Zarasha took a strand of golden hair from her plate and bound it round herself and Akshartag, and at once they became 2 big fish, shining with scales of mother of pearl, and thus they swam up to the surface of the sea. In the dark forest, on the seashore, Akshar built himself a tent of animal skins and awaited news of his brother. Once he saw that the waves cast up white foam on the shore, and he was very glad. "Alive and well, my brother will soon return happily to me. I shall go hunting for wild game, and maybe I shall be back in time for his return." So off he went to the hunt. "Where are my 2 sons? Shall I never see them again?" So said old Warkhag, and grief bent his head, and his great power was broken. But the Nart youths were glad that Akshar and Akshartag did not return, since they were always and everywhere so superior to them, and made them obey. They did not hesitate to mock Warkhag, and made him always take the cattle out to pasture as their shepherd, to insult him. Warkhag grew angry at this. More than once he deliberately drove some of the cattle into the sea and drowned them, or prodded them over the edge of an abyss, and they broke their necks. He remained in the wilds, and did not go to the villages of the Narts, but all the same he suffered more because of his absent sons. Akshartag and Zarasha came from the bottom of the sea and saw on the shore a tent made of skins. They looked inside, but Akshar was off hunting, and the tent was empty. When Zarasha entered the tent, all inside was lit up by the radiance of her face. Such a fine tent it was, and she said to Akshartag, "I cannot leave this place until I have sat and rested here a while." "Very well," replied Akshartag. "You sit here meanwhile, and I'll go and look for my brother." So Akshartag went off to the forest to find his brother. In the meantime, his brother returned home to his tent, and so the 2 brothers missed each other. Chapter 5. The Death of Akshar and Akshartag. Akshartag had been gone a long time when Akshar returned to his tent. When he entered, he caught sight there of Zarasha, and he said to himself, "O gods of gods, do not take away what happiness you have given us, neither on the road nor at home. How could I expect that Akshartag would not only return alive, but also bring his bride to my tent?" Zarasha glanced at Akshar and mistook him for her husband. Those fair-haired, tall, bright-eyed, wide-shouldered twin brothers were as like as 2 peas, so much that even Mother Earth and the God in heaven could not distinguish one from the other. "Why have you been so long away?" asked Zarasha. Akshar did not answer. "What is wrong with you? Don't you recognize your own wife? Did we not live a whole year together beneath the sea with Don Betir?" Thus Akshar was convinced that before him sat his brother's wife. Zarasha, mistaking Akshar for her husband, gathered her things for that night, and began to cling to him, but saw at once that he turned away from her, distressed. The time came to lie down and sleep. Silently Akshar spread out his felt cloak, and they lay on that, covering themselves with Akshartag's cloak, but so that there would be no intimacy between him and his brother's wife, Akshar drew his sword and placed it between himself and Zarasha. This so infuriated her that she, being deeply offended, rose from the bed and sat further away with a bitter, sad look on her face. Some time afterward, toward morning, the tent flap opened, and In stepped Akshartag. He had shot a deer and had brought a tree, branches and all, to make a fire. When he caught sight of Zarasha sitting with an offended look on her face and his brother sleeping under his cloak, jealousy crept into his soul. What if Akshar had taken advantage of his wife Zarasha? Why did she look so distressed? He took an arrow from his quiver and shot it up into the sky. "Oh God," he prayed, "let my arrow soar like two and return as one and pierce that place where he touched my wife." The arrow soared away and turned point downward and fell and struck Akshar's little finger, and immediately he died. Further distressed, Zarasha told Akshartag all exactly as it had happened, and he was seized by despair. Because of him, and his suspicion, his innocent brother had died. He straightway drew his sword, and placing the hilt on his brother's breast, and the pointed blade at his own heart, he leaned heavily forward upon his sword. The point pierced his breast, and thus Akshartag died. Zarasha's Lament. And then Zarasha tore her hair, beat with her fist on brow and knees, scratched her cheeks and cried in despair, "Oh, woe is me, black days are these. Because of me, brothers have died. Because of me, their blood was shed." She moaned and groaned, lamented, cried, and mountains echoed her woe overhead. Wild beasts in sorrow silent fell. On hearing her pitiful sad lament, her tears on blood-stained cheeks did swell, went streaming, gleaming, never spent. Her sorrow floated like a cloud above twin corpses as they lay. Her warm tears fell like a funeral shroud, but naught could wash her woe away. She sat between them till midnight came. Above the corpse of Akshar the bold, from midnight till morning just the same. Above Akshartag, his flesh grown cold. What shall I do with these poor dead men? Let ravens come, peck out their eyes. Let foxes come and gnaw at them, and tear their pallid cheeks likewise. I should make each of them a grave, but how can I do so alone? How bury them here, beside the wave, where all is stern, unyielding stone? Just then, Washtirji, a great spirit on a three-legged horse, and accompanied by a hunting hound, descended from the heavens to the earth. He then appeared before her and said, "O Zarasha, son of sons, ornament of the universe, my lovely world, and the beauty of the earth, long since I have followed in your tracks, and here I see you in great sorrow. What has happened to you?" "How could I not be sorrowful?" replied Zarasha. "I have been the cause of the death of these two brothers, and I do not know how I am going to bury them here." "Oh, woman," replied Washtiri, "I could of course bury them both, but if I do, then you must become my wife." Zarasha straightway answered, "Why should I not become your wife after you have buried them?" Hearing this, Washtirji slightly struck the earth with the handle of his whip, and the two bodies of the two brothers sank into a cavity in the ground. Then there arose a tomb of stones, united by mortar above their grave. Then above the risen tomb a beautiful palace arose. Washtirji then turned to Zarasha and said, "Well, now all is accomplished, and we can go. Wait here a moment while I go and wash my face and hands at the seashore." "How can I go with you like this? The blood has dried on my cheeks and fingers." So Zarasha answered him. Washtirji took her words as true, and off she ran to the seashore. She threw herself into the watery waves and sank below into her father's domain, the realm of Don Batir. Washtirji waited, and what kind of thoughts and wishes did not run through his head? "Where is that woman, then? The lovely Zarasha has disappeared. She has deceived me, Washtirji, and I shall not forget such deception. Just wait a while, and woe to your hearthstone," swore Washtirji. "In this world I may not be able to catch you, but how will you escape me in the land of the dead?" Washtirji flew into a fury, leapt on his three-legged horse, and called his hunting hound, and galloped off along the seashore to hunt. Chapter 6. The Birth of Urijmag and Khamis. Zarasha lived beneath the waters in the home of her parents, the Donbatirs. When her mother knew that Zarasha was expecting a child, she said to her, "Go now, my daughter, into the land of the Narts. Whoever is not born in their country, they will never recognize as their own." So the poor woman did as her mother had advised. With bowed head, she set out on her long journey. "Even if I reach a Nart village, who will take me in?" she wondered. Soon she came to such a village. Zarasha went near the square, the meeting place of the respected Nart elders. As is incumbent upon a bride, she bowed her head, and did not turn her back upon the old men. The Nart elders were surprised. "Who is she then? She showed us deep respect, as though she were one of our newlyweds. But all our young wives are here in the village. There are none who, according to the custom, or because of some offense or the other, would go back to their parents' home to stay with them." Then the elders said to the young Narts, "Go to our women and tell them to find out who this young woman stranger is, who comes as our guest." So the young Narts went to the Nart women and said to them, "Listen, young wives of ours, well-mannered and silent before your elders. Ask this newcomer why she too is silent before us. Is she one of our brides? You are respected older wives and mothers. Find out if she too is a respected mother, and learn her name, where she is from, and tell it to us." The young wives began to surround Zarasha and to question her. "Who are you, and what are you?" they clamored. But Zarasha did not answer, and thought to herself, "If I tell them who I am, my answer will not be heard by the elders from my own lips, and may not be believed." Then the mothers, seeing that she did not answer the young wives, went up to her and asked her, "Tell us, what brings you to the land of the Narts?" Zarasha answered, "Don't all ask me questions at once. If you wish to know who I am, and where I come from, let one of you speak, and I will answer." Then one of the most respected mothers took her to one side. "My sunshine, tell me, what brings you here? They all trust me here in this village, and you may trust me too." Then Zarasha glanced at the elderly mother and answered, "It is awkward for me to even mention my name and where I come from. It is shameful for me to stand on Nart land before you young Nart wives and respected mothers. It is against custom to utter it before you," replied Zarasha. "But there is no other way out for me, so despite that, I must tell it to you. My husband was Akshartag, and I beg you lead me only the ground floor of his tower, where the cattle live in winter." Then the woman told the young Narts whose bride she was, and they repeated it to the elders sitting in the village square. "This woman comes to us from those relatives of ours for whom we have been waiting for so long." The elders were glad to hear this news, and replied, "Let it be so then. If we have not heard from them so long, then nonetheless we shall learn from her what has happened to them. Only do not take her to old Warkhag's tower, but to the topmost chamber in Akshartag's bastion." When Zarasha, standing nearby, heard this, she said to the women, "It is not fitting for me to be there. Soon will come the time when I shall show you a new shoot off your family. Meanwhile, it were better and quieter for me to not be at the top of the tall tower, but in the shady cattle stall below." So the woman led her to the stall below in the tower, and there she gave birth to twin sons, Urishmag and Khamis, they named them. Chapter 7. How Urishmag and Khamis found their grandfather, Warkhag. By day 2 fingers, by night a hand's breadth grew her twin sons. But when they went out of doors for the first time from their home, and stood out on the street playing and shooting their bows, all of the Nart youngsters hid wherever they could from the whistling of arrows. At that time, Kulbadagush, Osiris, sent her only daughter to the spring to fetch some water. As soon as Khamis saw the girl, he shot an arrow at her, which smashed the jug to smithereens and tore her dress to pieces. Crying and sobbing bitterly, she returned home. "What happened to you, for goodness sake? Why did you return home so soon, and where's the water I sent you for?" "That mischievous young devil Khamis shot an arrow at me, and broke the jug to bits, and tore my dress to rags." Her mother gave her another jug and warned her, "Go again, my daughter, and don't come back without water. May the milk I fed you on as a babe fill you with some of my sharp words. If you can't answer back to such a young rascal, may you not have much luck in your life." The girl had only just stepped out of the house when Khamis again shot an arrow at her. "How easy it is to test your strength out on me," shouted the girl. "Any little bird of the forest is stronger than I, but if you are a bold young fellow, better go and find your old grandfather, Warkhag, who has withered away, wandering after the Nart's cattle." Having heard these offensive words, both boys broke their bows and arrows in a frenzy, and hearing and shouting like highway thieves, they burst into their house and told their mother, "We are going to the meeting place of the elders in the square. We have heard that our grandfather Warkhag is still alive. We want to go and find him. The elders may tell us where he is." They arrived on the square, where elders from all three Nart families gathered, and some of the younger Narts too. Urijmag and Kami said, "May fortune smile on your council." "May it smile on you as well," was the reply. "We have heard that our father's father, Warkhag, is still alive and pastures Nart cattle. We beg you to show us where we may find him. Let some of the younger boys go with you and show you the way." The lads led them to the pasture. As Urijmag and Kami strode toward their grandfather, the earth trembled beneath their feet and stones fell from the cliff sides. From far away, Warkhag heard the thunderous steps of Urijmag and his brother Kamis. "What a wonder is this?" thought he. "Akshar and Akshartag are no longer in the land of the living, but it seems to me I hear them." Suddenly, he saw the youngsters and called, "Hey, who are you then?" They answered him back, "We are the twin sons of Akshartag. Come nearer to me. Only by feeling your limbs and how you are made can I tell who you are and recognize you as my grandsons or not." Urijmag and Kamis came up to the old man and embraced him. And then Warkhag fell silent, while with the tips of his fingers he felt the wrist and knee joints. Tears began to flow from his eyes. "My sons Akshar and Akshartag have perished, but I am happy that our breed has not passed away." Thus he recognized his grandsons. Warkhag then led the youngsters back to his old tower. First they climbed upstairs to the chambers at the top, but saw that they could not enter for all the rubbish accumulated there. Then one brother took a wooden shovel, and the other took a broom, and they cleared away the rubbish and swept the rooms. All was shining bright when they finished, and everyone saw that the tower was 7 times more beautiful than before. Supporting their old grandfather by the armpits, they led him out into the courtyard, and they trimmed his shaggy hair and beard and whiskers. Then they stuck his staff into the rubbish outside and made him urinate on it, and they saw that his stream arced upward. They gaped at each other in surprise and said, one to the other, "Yes, indeed! He's still quite young, our granddad. He can still work and manage to feed our mother." They escorted him back to the hearth, sat him on a stool, and then said to him, "We are your sons, and from now on we shall live with you." While they were doing all this, Zarasha stayed in the upper part of Akshartag's tower. Now, having found their grandfather and put all things in order, they set off to meet their mother again. They took her with them to the old tower of their grandfather Warkhag, and old Warkhag, when he saw Zarasha, took her to be his wife. And that concludes part 1 of the Tale of the Narts, Warkhag and his sons. Please join us now for a discussion with Brendan, our editor. Gamarjoba, and welcome to the history of Sakartvelo, Georgia. This is Myth 5, Warkhag and his Sons, Part 2. Thank you for coming onto the show today, Brendan.
Thank you, Roberto. I must say, it's really impressive hearing your podcasting voice in person. You have a very good radio voice you're putting on there.
Oh, thank you. I try really hard once I'm in front of the mic. So today we are discussing Warkhag and his sons. I would like to give thanks to the artist Sylvan for letting me use their artwork. So thank you very much. Your artwork is great, and I love the fact that you did convert the Tale of the Narts into an actual comic strip. And that's all for Sylvan. So, Brendan, we both read Tale of the Narts. I want to know, what were your impressions of the book? So I have stuff to say.
I'm not fresh on it because I read it about a week ago. I was just going over the introduction before, but I read about an hour a couple weeks ago. And when I was younger, I guess I was much more cynical. Like stories about like families and all this emotional stuff and crying didn't affect me as much. But now I think one time I was just very struck by what a good job that the translators did here of presenting the emotional content of the stories, because it is an extremely sad story. We'll be talking about it soon, but one thing that's been annoying me about Shota Rustaveli's A Night in the Panther Skin, which is a famous Georgian epic poem, the national epic poem of Georgia's, just how much crying there is. There's just so much repetitive stuff about, oh, they cried so much. And here I think the translators did a better job of presenting the emotional content of the story that probably would have resonated more with the audience at the time, which I think in the introduction said it was a purely oral tradition until the 60s, I want to say.
Yeah, it was purely oral tradition until somewhere around the 60s. And what actually is really nice about this is that I believe, this is just my opinion from for everyone else, that because it was such an oral tradition, you had to convey the emotions to the people, because it's one of those things you just can't kind of read outright unless it's written down. And a lot of times, a lot of these stories were not written down. Even going with like the Ossetian tradition, they kind of go forth and just kind of represent their culture through their stories. And you can see a lot of the stuff they kind of think about and stuff that they go through, and just like their mentality, just by reading these sagas through that is just very apparent throughout their culture. So
Yeah, I mean, one thing I noticed was just like with it's the case with a lot of myths and with a lot of sagas, like the saga of the Volsungs. It's in Norse mythology. It's fundamentally a story about a particular family, and that's the impression that I get with Warkhag and its sons. It's a story about Warkhag and his sons. It's about their family. I think we'll get more into that as we look at the introduction written by Vasily Abayev.
I read this book yesterday because and the day before, because I was literally recording this whole book for everybody. So what my thoughts were is that I was actually quite impressed with how well developed the stories were, even though they were quite short. There was just a series of different stories which you would just find within the cultural tradition of many different places. So such as the Greeks, they had tales for each of their gods. So they had kind of like, you had like small descriptions of like, here's some random stories of stuff that they did, of their demigods, their heroes who just kind of did different things. But you don't have this whole long form explanation of everything they did. You just find that a lot later, once Homer comes into play, or once you start reading, Virgil's the Aeneid, or which is Rome, or you start reading just even further on, just in the Argonauts with Apollonius of Rhodes, and even then, like you have Euripides with Medea, and like you have all of these Greek heroes that they show different formats, but when you get down to the oral tradition, you just have this one. You have parts of the saga of this family. So you have part one is literally Warkhag and his sons. It is setting up the whole fundamental of how did this start? How did the Nart people start? And I think this is actually a really good segue to kind of start talking about how did the Nart start, with just kind of this whole premise that we have going on for us now.
All this information that I'm about to relate comes from the introduction to the book by Vasily Ivanovich Abayev, who I believe it's explained in the preface to the book that he was a Soviet historian and he was one of the first people to translate, write down, and analyze the tales of the Narts. Like we said earlier, it's a story about family, but it's specifically a legend about the origins of the Nart people, and the Nart people and the Ossetians are the same, as I understand it, right?
Yes, they're exactly the same. It is just a different name for themselves. Narts are what they end up calling themselves a bit more, but throughout time, it's become more and more like Ossetian.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't take a course in Ossetian history, unfortunately. Before I started this, I just read this book. So
I didn't know we needed to have history degrees to do all of this.
yeah, well, yeah, thankfully I have the ability to read, so I just sort of bypass all that. Anyway, so Vasily Ivanovich Abayev, we'll just call it Abayev from now on, explains that all of the stories in this book, the Tales of the Narts, deal with four central cycles, which is the origins of the Narts, which is the first one we're talking about here, Warkhag and his sons Akshar and Akshartag, and then later Ruzmag and Shitana form the second cycle, then Soshlan form the third cycle, and Latrads form the fourth cycle. And so today we're just dealing with Warkhag and his sons, and it tells the origins of the Nart people, specifically the family which is called the Akshartag Keta, which is hard for me to pronounce because it's spelled Akshartag and then they add Ketta. So I have to stop and say Akshartag Keta every time.
Akshartag. Yeah, so it's one of those fun ones. It's just Akshartag is essentially the founder of this everything here.
Right. And so Abayev also writes that the story of Akshar and Akshartag, he says, quote, I have argued that fundamentally behind the story of the twins Akshar and Akshartag lies the totemistic myth of the origin of the tribe as a wolf, entirely analogous to the legend of Romulus and Remus. So what he's saying there is just as the story of Romulus and Remus find the mythological or legendary foundation of the Roman culture, Akshar and Akshartag form the mythological and legendary foundations of the Ossetian culture. And he even points out that the word Warkhag in ancient Ossetian simply means wolf.
Yeah, and I would also like to point out to kind of tie it back more to our podcast is George's name also technically refers back to the wolf because if, as I mentioned back way back in episode one, the whole Gorgia, Gurgan is also from an old Persian word meaning wolf. So it's like you have this whole Caucasus region. You have a lot of these origin stories from different regions, such as the Caucasus, essentially referencing to a wolf being kind of like the totemic forebear of everything.
Right, so this very ties very neatly back into the first episode. So he also notes the Narts descended from the daughter of the water god Zarash Shah, which is another difficult name to pronounce. And Abayev speculates that the Ossetian Alans, I don't think he explains what the Alans are. I think it's another word for this people.
It's literally another word for Ossetian.
Okay.
You have the Ossetians, you have the Narts, you have the Alans. Yes, it's just kind of different ways to refer to them. Just the same way I do in my shows, like, oh yeah, the Iberians, the Kartveli, the Colchians, just different names throughout history. So the Alans came after, essentially, there was a place called Alania, for the kingdom of Alania for quite a while. And that is what that refers to.
Right, anyway, and so he mentions that in the story, of course, Zarashasha is the daughter of the people of the sea. I forget if they're deities exactly. You'll have to remind me.
They're just another Nart. Well, they're not even Narts. They're just another like race of people from that area, is what I could tell from the reading. I might be wrong, but from what I can tell from reading this, they were just another people of the area who just live in the sea.
Oh, wait, well, Abayab says right here that Zarashasha is meant to be a water goddess. So he mentions there's two things: is mythologically the Nart people are descended from the wolf and from water deities, or they're associated with water deities.
So that explains a lot more. Shows how much care I put into reading the introduction.
Oh, well, it's good because I read it, so don't worry. Well, as long as we're on the topic, did you want to mention anything about the introduction that struck you?
I mean, in relation to Akshar and Akshartag, it's essentially there's not much there other than the fact that you have these twins that you find in like Roman and Greek mythology. You have Romulus and Remus, Castor and Pollux, and you just have this sense of twins just kind of being influenced by all of these people. So it's just kind of interesting to see how you have the wolf essentially being a thing that occurs very often throughout mythology, as well as also having twins kind of being the forebears of your area. Because I know Castor and Pollux were in Jason and the Argonauts as well. And then in India, you have the Ashvins also. So it's just another motif that you have of just like twins kind of appearing and kind of being forebears for a people. And one of them always has to die somehow.
I believe one of the Castor and Pollux twins is killed somehow. Are they killed in Jason and the Argonauts? I forget.
I don't think they're killed in Jason and the Argonauts, but I know they're the sons of that wind god.
Yeah, I think they're sons of Boreas.
Yeah, they're the sons of Boreas. Shows how much potential we pay to our own show.
I mean, how long ago do we do that? Come on. We're not.
Quite a while back. It's been a few months. We took a break.
Yeah, the twins thing was really interesting to me because I also, besides the examples of Romulus and Remus, Castor and Pollux, and the Ashvins of Hindu mythology, this also shows up in the story of Apollo and Artemis. And this also is a good segue into another interesting thing I noticed about Akshar and Akshartag is one thing they have in common with other stories across Greek and Roman and Norse mythology is not prodigy, precociousness of growing up instantly. So Akshar and Akshartag in the story, they seem to grow up instantly. They grow up within like a year.
No, they grew up within days, actually. Within days. And like that's actually something which leads us right into the birth of Akshar and Akshartag, which is the first bit of the story. And like they essentially, from what I could see, is they were literally born and within like hours they're already growing like essentially super quickly. And I'm like, how is this happening so quickly already? It's like and then they do things in increments of a year as well, which I thought was also interesting.
Yeah, so the quote here is Akshar and Akshartag grew with each passing hour. In one day they grew 2 inches, in a night a whole hand's breadth. They were a mischievous pair. They made for themselves bows and arrows, and there was not a bird who could fly over their heads. And of course, if you've heard the story, you would know that their prowess with bows and arrows is major plot element, which makes sense because the Ossetians are a nomadic horse people, the way Abayev describes them. And so continuing on with this thing about growing up instantly, and this also happens with Apollo and Athena. I think the story goes that either Apollo sorry, not Apollo and Athena, Apollo and Artemis. I forget the name of their mother, but she was a Titan. Their father was Zeus, and said that as soon as one was born, the other assisted their mother in delivering their younger twin. And another example of this is Athena was said to emerge fully formed from Zeus's skull, and the Olympians were all said to have emerged as full adults from the stomach of Cronus when he vomited them up. And Hercules, as an infant, strangled two serpents that were sent to his crib by Hera. Sorry, not Hercules, Heracles. I'm sure some people in the audience are going to be mad I said Hercules instead of Heracles. The final example off the top of my head came from Norse mythology. I don't know if this is in the prose or poetic Edda. I haven't read either, which I plan to change soon. But Thor's sons, Magni and Modi, I believe are also meant to be twins. But if not, they still have the precociousness aspect of it, because there's a story where Thor went out to fight a stone giant, and when he killed him in one blow with Mjolnir, his hammer, the giant fell on him. And even Thor, who, as strong as he is to wield his hammer, he still needs a magic belt that like doubles his strength so he can wield it. And he still can't get the giant off. But one of his sons, either Magni or Modi, I forget which, I think it was Magni, walks over, and he's not even supposed to be a day old at this point, although he's older in other stories. He just flips the stone giant off of him that Thor could not even move. And eventually whichever one did that is said to eventually inherit Mjolnir, because he doesn't even need Thor's magic belt to hold it. He's that strong. So that's another motif that you see in these stories that you can find throughout a lot of other myths throughout human culture.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of just overall, it's like even in the premise of Akshar and Akshartag, because I'm not great with mythology, I just read the stuff that I like. You can kind of tell like they grew up within like, because the end quote here that you have in the book is that the whole world soon knew that the Nart Warkhag had two gallant grown-up twin sons, Akshar and Akshartag, but it does not say how long it took for them to grow up, except you see that they essentially grow within a whole hand in a night. So it's a few days before they're grown up. So like these kids are like, you can kind of tell why they make some stupid decisions as they go on, because they're not old enough to make these smart decisions, essentially.
Right.
Which I think, and speaking of smart decisions, I think it's a good time to head over to the next part of the Warkhag and his sons, is Akshar's sword.
Yeah, I thought that story was really interesting because it's an example of a explanatory story. I mean, a lot of people have heard things as kids of like why leopards have spots. As a kid, I had a book, I think we still have it, that my dad has, of African tales. And there's one story about how a bird got his spots because he rolled around in a campfire and got white ash on his coat. But so it's an explanatory story in that sense, but it's also one that justifies the particular, I guess you could call it, social regime, the Ossetians, because it seems to me like many cultures throughout human history, although certainly not all of them, it's not patrilineal, but it's the term for the oldest son inherits everything.
Primogeniture.
Yeah, primogeniture. So it's a story that not only explains the tradition of primogeniture, the tradition of the oldest son inheriting everything is simultaneously explained and justified here. So if somebody, a younger son, a younger brother that got a little too big for his britches said, "Oh, why can't I have father's sword? Why do I need his stupid horse?" Well, they would go back to this story and say, well, the founder of our culture established this tradition by saying, after Akshar's death, his eldest son inherited his sword. Since then, it has been Nart custom the eldest son receives his father's sword, and the youngest son his horse.
Okay, but my question is, I mean, I don't even care if we jump around in the stories, but Akshar doesn't have a kid, as far as we know.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, just kind of, since we're on the topic of primogeniture and all that, Akshar does not have a kid. There's a reason they call it the Akshartag Beketar. The Akshartag Beketar. Yeah. So like basically Akshartag is the one who is essentially the founding drop of his family, but it's still Warkhag, which is something we'll get into later episodes or just later readings of the Nart Sagas. But Akshar doesn't have a child to kind of give things to as far as we're told. Now, that could be a different story, but I feel like that would have been a big thing if Akshar got married, because we know Akshartag did get married. So does Akshartag's son just inherit everything at this point then?
I suppose so. I mean, if I recall correctly, Akshartag kills his brother and then kills himself, and then the only one left is
In some renditions, yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, mythology is inconsistent. It depends on who's telling the story. But in this particular story, yeah,
And the story reread.
yeah, Akshartag kills Akshar and then himself. So I guess Zarashasha gets all of it then.
Yeah, sounds like that's what happens. But yeah, so like in Akshar's sword, essentially just Akshar and Akshartag decide to go journeying around the world. They come to a crossroads and they're like, let's split up, but we're going to leave arrows under this boulder. Let's meet back in a year, because it's always a year in the Nart Sagas somehow. And Akshartag comes back a year later, but Akshar hasn't returned. So he sets off on Akshar's path and finds a tent, which is going to bring in my next point, is he sees this weird light coming through and he just shoots an arrow into the tent.
Yeah, I sort of read that as, like you said, an example of Akshar's immaturity. Wait, is this Akshar or Akshartag?
Akshartag shot an arrow into the tent.
Right. So it's an example of their immaturity. You can always find the values of a society couched within their stories. And part of that is the praise for war and valor in battle. At the very beginning of the story, I believe it says, okay, well, somewhere it says that the Ossetians or the Narts are the most valorous and bravest and most skillful in battle. And of course, Akshar and Akshartag respectively mean brave and the bravest. And I read this thing about, well, it's partly a story about solving with problems with violence. Because this happens 3 times. And each time they accidentally hurt one of their own family members. The final time it ends in someone's death.
Like the second time they're guarding something, so that makes sense to me.
Oh, yeah. The second time they harm Zarashasha, but she does end up later marrying Akshartag, which we'll cover. But it's violence, shooting arrows specifically, is used as an inciting incident in 3 of these stories. They shoot somebody, find out they have a reason to regret it, and then have to go do something in order to remedy their mistake.
He shoots his aunt in the eye. She's blind. She's already blind in one eye.
Yeah, and they have to go through all this rigmarole to go into the woods and find
morning dew and drops of morning dew and doe's milk, and they have to like get like herbs and like rub into her eye to like heal her eye up.
Yeah,
and it's like, I don't know. I just found it kind of funny. We're just like, yeah, oh, interesting, weird light coming from here. What could that be? Joink, shoots an arrow, and it's like, oh, my eye. And I'm like, Akshartag, what the heck are you doing? Like, think before you do things.
Yeah, so I thought the attitude towards violence in the story is really just really interesting, because they simultaneously sort of praise and what's the opposite of praise? Praise and scold. The storytellers sort of implicitly both praise and scold Akshar and Akshartag for how good they are at violence, because they associate their names with good things. The brave and the bravest is presumably referring to battle or hunting, but they always tend to find ways to get them into trouble because of their ostensibly good qualities. So I read that as sort of the storytellers warning people, like, don't use violence all the time to solve every problem, because sometimes you might shoot your aunt in the eye.
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those things. It's like you have to make it super apparent that they're like being dumb, because it's like, yeah, like you don't shoot things because you might cause more problems than you can solve. But then he fixes his aunt's eye up, and then she's like, oh, my husband's stuck down there, and your brother's also down there. And I have this magic scarf that tells me if your brother's in danger. And, oh, look, it's bleeding. So he must be in danger. And then, they go down into this, I think they have to wait a few days for, the doorway to be able to open to the Bisanog's lair. And as they climb down, they're climbing down on her husband's beard, which somehow just became so long that it's a ladder now. And then they get to the bottom, and they cut the guy's beard off and save him. And I'm like, how are you going to get back to the top now? Don't ask questions. It's a myth.
Don't ask questions. And then the solution is kill everyone.
Yeah, the solution to the story is kill everyone. And then they find Akshar at the end of the place, and they free him. And they're like, oh, Akshar's like, oh, I found this ore that I thought would be really cool to make into a sword. So let's go get that ore and get the heck out of Dodge and go to this god of blacksmithing, who's also the person who named him Kurdalagon, and to make him a sword. And then the sword gets made within a few days, and then the Bisanogs come back out, and they're like, "We want revenge for killing everybody!" And they can't even win the battle until they have some random traitorous Bisanog say, "Hey, pour fish oil all over your sword," because And then once you start fighting, and then they start fighting, and the sword of the head Bisanog shatters, and Akshar kills the guy. So it's because Akshar is, he's the head brother. He gets a cool thing, but like Akshartag is the hero of this saga part for sure. Because Akshartag is the one who starts everything. He's the one who does everything. Akshar is just kind of like, I'm here for the ride. I get my cool fight scene, and then I'm out.
Right. Yeah. And then it just struck me the bizarreness of any myth or legend is always apparent. It's this Donbatir servant, Donbatir deities, I believe, whisks Akshartag off to the Milky Lake so he can bathe him in its healing waters, where he immediately recovered consciousness. And I don't think they even mention a horse anywhere in the story, so how they decided that there's a real plot hole why the youngest son gets the father's horse.
Yeah, and I'm like, so yeah, that was basically one thing. I was like, okay, cool. I know why the oldest gets the sword now, because he's the one who beat the oldest brother is the one who beat the bad guy. Cool. But where did the horse come from? I don't see any horses anywhere in the story.
Yeah. Horses are probably not mentioned. There's probably some version of the story.
Well, there probably is, but this is a version we have.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you heard a different version of the story, please enlighten us.
Please do.
Where on earth this horse is coming in on?
Yes, tell us about the horse, guys. Tell us about the horse. And then, I think it's time for us to kind of continue on to the next story, the Apple of the Narts, which is essentially what sets up the whole ending, and it's also the shortest story in here.
Yeah, it's also one of my favorite stories because I really like the love story between Zarashasha and Akshartag. But first, I just want to briefly point out golden apples of immortality show up in
Heracles.
Yeah, Heracles' story. They show up in Jewish tradition with the story of Adam and Eve. Although I think the golden apple thing might be a later invention than when that story was originally conceived, which probably means that it has its origins in Mesopotamian mythology, because pretty much all of these stories have their roots in Mesopotamian mythology in one way or another a lot of the time. Although I think somewhere it's mentioned, I might have even read this on Wikipedia, but I couldn't pull up the exact source. But I think this particular instance of including a golden apple of immortality might be as a result specifically of Greek influence on Ossetian culture.
Oh, for sure, because the Greeks were totally in the area, without a doubt.
Right.
They had things there
Well,
forever.
we've covered this. Yeah.
We covered this a lot.
Yeah, we covered this a lot.
If you're at this point in the podcast, you know the influence is there.
Yeah, and golden apples of immortality show up again in Norse mythology, although I'm not sure, I couldn't validate this, but I wonder if there's also, again, maybe some kind of cross-cultural influence there. But to put it briefly, in Norse mythology, the Aesir gods eat golden apples of immortality to maintain their youth, and there's a story about Loki being forced to trick the goddess Garza into giving them up, and then the Aesir forced Loki to go get them back again. Yeah, golden apples of immortality, again, that's something that shows up all over the place. Also, one thing I just had on my notes here I wanted to touch on briefly is how many of their stories are about either going underground or underwater. And I think Abayev talks about this. But as we know, in this story, Akshart and Akshartag are forced to pursue this injured bird to a underwater people who are called
the Donbatir, I think.
Yeah, the Donbatir. Yeah, so they're forced to pursue this injured bird underwater into this underwater kingdom, I guess you could call it. And that's where Akshartag meets his future wife, the water goddess Zarashasha. Again, this is difficult to pronounce because there's two sh sounds, so I was calling her like Zarashasha in my head when I was reading this, but Roberto just explained it's probably like Zarashasha, something like that.
Zarashasha. Yeah, you just have a longer sounding SH sound, I guess. Zarasha or Zarashsha. I've been saying Zarasha because that way you still get both SH sounds at the end, but because you can hear it like Zarasha, I'm saying it both. So I don't know. It's language. Language is weird. At the point, you can read it yourself.
Anyway, there are quite a lot of stories about going underground or underwater, which again is not uncommon in many other cultures. For one, I think of, there's a story of Orpheus. There's several stories of Greek heroes going to Hades, which is the underworld of the afterlife. Orpheus does this and also retrieves his wife, I believe. And Odysseus, or Ulysses as he's known to the Romans, also does that in order to talk to a dead prophet.
Yeah, so in this story, depending on how you see it, like he goes after the injured bird, which is ends up being Zarasha, who can transform into a bird or a fish. And in doing so, he has to go underwater because the bird just goes underwater.
Just a side note, that bird, it's the swimming fish from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Rankin Bass uh TV special.
Yeah, so it says here how Akshartag gets to the bottom of the water is then Akshartag pulled up the ends of his overcoat and stepped into the water, and down to the bottom he went. But one thing I did like was the fact that the artist Sylvan in their comic for the Golden Apple is they actually have Akshartag like splitting the water open and then going down, which I thought was a lot cooler. I'm actually going to link the whole chapter into my website, and I'm going to put up some pictures as like the podcast picture for the episode picture. I mean, because I just like their art so much, and so I'm going to put that up on the website so you can read it and put links there. Make sure you check all their work out. They're great. They have other stuff too, but yeah, no, he just goes down there, and then like apparently Zarasha has like 7 siblings, and then like 3 sisters, 4 brothers, or 7 brothers, 2 sisters, and each sister is much more beautiful than the other, which I don't know how you can kind of compare that. And then Zarasha is supposed to be the most beautiful of them all. Oh man, they have more siblings than I do. That's weird. You just play 1, but still. So they literally go down and actually 7, 2 sisters. No, it's about right. It's about the same as I do. So actually, never mind. Same amount. So then he kind of goes in, and they're like, "Oh, what's it? Why are you guys crying?" And they're like, "Oh, my sister's been injured, and it is because of Akshartag. We're gonna curse Akshar and Akshartag and the rest of their family. I hope he dies. I hope they kill each other." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's mean." And they're like, and then Akshartag is just like, "Oh, I am Akshartag. But I have the wing right here. I can heal her up." And you did mention, you would marry anybody who could heal her. So I'm going to marry her, I guess, because I can heal her. So he literally goes in, like puts her wing back somehow, I think. And then like they end up getting married, and she gets pregnant, and then she's almost about to give birth. And they're like, "We should probably go back to your place because in Ossetian tradition, there's this big thing where like men can't live with their wives because that is so looked down upon, and to live with your wife gives you the name of midagmoy, which essentially translates to a domesticated man, because you don't want to be domesticated, you want to be a warrior who's outside doing things. And so if you're domesticated, that means you're doing all the housework, you're helping your wife out with chores. And what kind of man would you be if you actually did stuff in your house and not go out hunting or fighting? Like, come on. This isn't toxic patriarchy at all.
Speaking of, another interesting note that the book puts here we go. Up until the 19th century, Ossetians had a domestic traditions according to which the wife of a deceased husband wed an unmarried member of his family, most usually a brother. In this case, it was Warkhag because his brother was dead. Akshartag's widow married Akshartag's father, which
Yeah, I was going to mention that in that part of the book.
sounds very strange, but apparently this was custom, and the explanation was this custom was maintained because of an enormous arad, or bride price, which was demanded right up until the October Revolution in Ossetia. By keeping the dead man's wife in the family, they thus preserved a useful worker in the home and avoided having to pay colossal sums for a bride from another family. So this is, just like you said, it's another example of the dominance of men in Ossetian traditional society. Women are treated more or less as resources which one cannot afford to lose.
That's a horrible mentality, but this is the culture that we're kind of looking at. And like in like small remote mountain villages, you can still see this like whole bride price thing still being a thing, and they still practice this stuff because that's the thing about the Caucasus is it's hard to root out some things when they're in the mountains and you can't get to them. So but just kind of continue on with the rest of the story. Akshartag gets married to Zarasha, and at this point, when Akshartag left, he told Akshar to wait for a year, and Warkhag is like, "Oh my gosh, my sons are gone. I haven't seen them in forever," because they were supposed to guard the tree, and then they disappear. So Warkhag's like, oh my god, they're dead.
Fantastic job. Not only did you let a bird get the apple, you were gone for years.
You're literally gone for a year. Did not tell their dad anything. And then, like, just leading on to part 5 of this book, Akshar, Tag, and Zarashaf, they come up to the surface. Akshar is, he's gone hunting because he's like, oh, my brother should be back up because the sea foam turned white, so that meant my brother's coming back and he's fine. And he goes out to go hunting to get some meat for them all to celebrate. Akshartag is like, oh, I'm gonna go hunting to wait for my brother, and they completely bypass each other because they probably went off in like different directions. And Akshar returns back to his tent, and Zarasha's like, oh my gosh, my husband's back, because Akshartag is probably an idiot, didn't tell her. Akshar's my exact twin brother.
It's a real soap opera situation with the identical twins being confused for each other.
Yeah, they were being confused for each other. Zarasha's trying to cuddle up and be loving towards Akshar, and Akshar's like rejecting her. He's like, this is my brother's wife. I'm not going to touch her. And then Akshar decides, I'm going to go to sleep, wait for my brother. Zarasha is just offended at the fact that like Akshar has rejected her because she thinks it's Akshartag. And then Akshartag returns and he sees his wife completely like annoyed and like upset at Akshar. And he's like, Akshar must have touched her. He must have done something for her. And then he points his bow up to the heavens and goes, may my arrows smite him exactly where he touched her. And then he looses his arrow. It hits him right in his little pinky. Because it was kind of like, he was probably like, get away. And must have like slightly touched her. Dies from the pinky. So I'm like, that must have been like his Achilles heel. Or, his Achilles pinky.
Because he dies instantly.
He dies instantly. And then Zarash is like, oh my god, let me explain the whole situation to you. And he's like, oh my gosh, I did the horrible thing. And then literally puts his sword against his brother and falls on his sword. And Zarash is like, oh my god, this is all my fault. And I'm like, no, it's probably Akshartag's fault for not thinking you did things through yet again. Because as we mentioned, he just likes to let loose his arrow all the freaking time. And essentially, at that point, Zarasha starts lamenting, and then you get Washtirji, who is actually St. George.
Yeah, I'm sure he is.
Yes, Washtirji is St. George, according to, like, the research I did. And he's essentially coming down, he goes like, Zarasha, if I help bury these two twins, you must marry me.
Yeah, very pious of him.
Very pious of him. It's like, you must marry me, because apparently St. George is very horny. And he essentially goes, okay. And then he buries them, and Zarasha's like, okay, no, let me go wash up, because I'm covered in blood. And then she escapes back to her homeland. And then, like, she gets closer and closer to giving birth. And then her mom is like, you need to go back, because then your sons won't be Narts. They won't be born in their own land, which is looked really down upon too. So she returns. There's this whole ordeal about her not talking to anybody because she just want to be like, she can only talk to a certain person. And then like the elder lady comes to her and is like, you need to answer our questions. She says, oh, I'm carrying Akshartag's kids. And they're like, let's put you in Akshartag's bastion. And she's like, no, just put me at the bottom level, because the bottom level at these, like, because they live in towers. I'll probably put some pictures of anything I can find. And essentially, like, the bottom level is for cattle and like for domestic goods, and then like everything in between the cattle, the ground floor and the top floor is for like living quarters, and then the top floor is an observation deck. So these usually range from like 4 to 7 stories in height, and they're like conical in design. So she's like, no, with me about to give birth, it's gonna be really hard to get up and down those stairs, probably, or that ladder. So she's like, let me give birth on the ground floor. And then she gives birth to her 2 sons, who are also twins, Urishmag and Khamis. And that is another fun story, which we're going to continue with because it's still part of the Warkhag and his sons. Would you like to take it off from here, Brendan?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch on again the thing about Akshartag solving things, attempting to solve things with violence and then having to remedy it. This is the 3rd time it's happened. Get it together. But yeah, I thought it was a really interesting way. The attitude towards violence, or the sort of, it's very Greek in a way, because these heroes have a virtue, being brave or good at violence, which is also their downfall at the same time. It's interesting how different cultures approach that sort of topic.
Yeah, no, it's just kind of funny because it's like they all have their downfall. Like Jason was very like, he had a lot of hubris. He was like, yeah, I'm gonna marry this princess and be the king. I'll be an inherited king. And Medea basically is like, no, you're not. Like, you're married to me. I'm going to take you down because you said you're going to be with me forever. I literally killed my family for you. And your cousins.
Yeah, and it's Medea's treachery that helps Jason out of the situation. But when he crosses her, Medea's treachery ends up with his downfall.
Yeah, but like in this case, it's the fact that Akshar and Akshartag are essentially.
Not to say that Jason doesn't deserve it.
Oh, Jason totally deserves it. I will say that to the end of my days. I hate Jason so much.
Well, he's in hell. That's good.
Yes. And just to kind of continue on is Akshar and Akshartag, they really don't do anything bad except they don't think, which I think is the worst thing they do. It's just like they're so proud to be warriors and great with their bows, is that they just don't think about the things that they're doing ahead of time. Because how many things in this story could have been solved with talking? You know, to be fair, two of them were shooting down Zarasha with a bow and arrow was kind of called for because they were guarding the apple tree. But like shooting his aunt in the eye and then killing his brother without asking him what was going on is like, hey, these are 2 times you injured your family because you didn't think things through. And I think that was like essentially Akshartag being an idiot because he's the boldest. The boldest doesn't mean the smartest.
Yeah, which is funny. This is well, I'll save this point for the end, but yeah, the point again is something I think that is not like too. We talk about virtues and vices as if they're separate things. Most often, this is simply how our culture compartmentalizes those things. Here, it's the same thing is simultaneously a virtue and a vice, which is bravery, skill with a bow, things that, are good for hunting and war and things that you need to survive in the Ossetian culture. Yeah, are things that also bring their downfall. It's approach that's really refreshing because it doesn't deny the moral complexity of heroes. Many Greek heroes are very unheroic sometimes, like Jason, for example.
Oh God, he is so unheroic.
Hmm.
But
But our heroes are like Superman is. No matter what happens, he's the big blue Boy Scout. That's not what heroes are like in these cultures.
they are warriors through and through. Like they will fight things, they will kill things,
Hmm.
and they're gonna shoot before they talk. Shoot
Yeah,
first, ask questions later.
yeah, they fight even and especially when it's unwise.
Exactly. And just to kind of continue on, then you have Zarasha gives birth to her twin sons, Urijmag and Khamis, who essentially have the exact same thing. They grew up within days, which I mean, this is explained with the fact that they are the child of a goddess. So I was like, that makes more sense to me than Akshar and Akshartag is being born out of the blue with no named mother, and they just grow up in like days. Urijmag and Khamis are essentially tyrants, just like their father was, and they are shooting things left and right. There's this seer woman who essentially has a daughter, and she asks the daughter, "Hey, go get some water." And then the twins end up shooting the vase and shattering it, and then she's like, "Oh my gosh,
And tore her dress to pieces.
yeah," it breaks it to pieces, and then she goes back, and then her mom's like, "You drank my breast milk. You can literally tell them off as much as possible. You have my words in you." Then she goes off. It's like, she's like, "Oh, you guys are so mean. Like, you guys can shoot me, who's weaker than a bird, but you can't even take care of your own granddad, who's out in the woods by himself."
Yeah,
And then
which is a pretty good burn.
it was a great burn. Like, let me see if I can find it here. "How easy it is to test your strength out on me," shouted the girl. "Any little bird of the forest is stronger than I. But if you're a bold young fellow, better go and find your old grandfather Warkhag, who has withered away, wandering after the Nart's cattle." And like, the boys are so offended that they broke their bows and their arrows and like go after their mom and like, "We know where our grandfather is. We're gonna look for him now. We know he's alive." And then like they go look for him, and then like they find him all like bedraggled, like he hasn't shaven in weeks and everything. Warkhag is like, "I don't believe you're my grandsons. Let me touch you," and like, I'm going to touch your elbows and knees to make sure that you are. Does so, and like, "Oh my gosh, you are my grandsons." And then the boys are like, "Hey, Grandpa, can you pee for us?"
Wait, did they say that? Hold on.
Essentially, they're like,
Oh, right.
yeah, they're literally like, "Hey, Grandpa, can you pee for us?" And then like his stream, it arced upward, and it's like, "Oh my gosh, Grandpa has a lot of vigor in his system still. He should marry our mother," which actually goes back to the point that you made earlier, was the fact that usually mothers tend to like, if a woman is widowed, she has to marry someone within her husband's family who is a bachelor, and that way that she can stay with the family and it's all going on. But instead, she's like, she's literally marrying her father-in-law, and Warkhag adopts Urijmag as his like children, essentially, at this point.
Right. And there's one line here that I wanted to point out. Urzmog and Kamis came up to the old man and embraced him, and then Warkhag fell silent. While the tips of his fingers he felt their wrists and knee joints. Tears began to flow from his eyes. My sons Akshar and Akshartag have perished, but I am happy that our breed has not passed away. Thus he recognized his grandsons. And I think this is fundamentally the structure of the story, which is it's a story about how two great warriors and how their family are repeatedly separated and reunited. So the brothers are separated from their father and then from each other when they go off on their great adventure. They're reunited with their long lost aunt, which they probably weren't even aware of apparently. Otherwise, I think their father would have told, hey, your aunt lives in a hole in the ground that glows.
Yeah, but like they don't mention all that stuff. But anyways, it's kind of like and at the end, Zarasha literally marries Warkhag, and that is the end of part 1, which I'm not going to get further into because I haven't read past that. So
neither have I.
Yes, you have.
No, I haven't.
Oh, really?
I seriously haven't.
Oh,
no, I haven't.
Okay,
I've been reading Night in the Panther Skin.
Okay, let's continue on. And I think that is actually it for the discussion because we are hitting the hour mark. It might seem shorter for you guys after I edit stuff because we had a lot of side tangents that make no sense to anyone else but Brendan and I. So it was a pleasure having you guys listen to us kind of talk about Warkhag and his sons and just kind of pick up on the themes that we saw. Brendan, as always, does a great job of picking up all the stuff. And I am great to just add funny commentary and just kind of listen to everything. But thank you, Brendan, for coming on today.
Thank you very much, Roberto.
And I can't wait to see you for the first year anniversary of the show.
I can't wait to see you. See you then.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
To support us, feel free to look us up on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram as The History of Sackettville, Georgia, on Twitter at history_Georgia, on our website at historyofsackettville.com, or on our email at thehistoryofsackettville@gmail.com. Sackettville is spelled Saquartvelo. For more direct support, you can buy us a coffee. The link is in the episode transcription and on our website. Our Amazon wishlist is also available if you'd like to purchase a book for us. Also, a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your preferred podcast host goes a long way with getting the word out about the show and helping us reach new people to learn about Georgia. Madlaba na nachvamdis, and thank you for listening to The History of Sackettville, Georgia. See you next time.